All right, here we go. Chapter 10 of the end of laws, of their characters and differences. Some perhaps will complain that we have dwelt too long on the nature and foundation of sovereignty, but the importance of the subject requires us to treat it with care and to unravel properly its principles. Besides, we apprehend that nothing could contribute better to a right knowledge of the nature of law, and we shall presently see that whatever in fact remains for us to still remains for us still to say concerning this subject is deduced from the principles just now established. In the first place, we may be asked, what is the end and design of laws? This question presents itself with two different faces, namely with respect to the subjects and with regard to the sovereign, a distinction that must be carefully observed. The relation of the sovereign to his subject forms a kind of society between them, with the sovereign, which the sovereign directs by the laws he establishes, but as society naturally requires. There should be some provision made for the good of all those who are the constituent parts thereof. 'Tis by this principle we must judge of the end of laws, and this end, considered with respect to the sovereign, ought to include nothing in the opposite to the end of these very laws considered with regards to the subjects. The end of law in regard to the subjects is that they should conform their actions thereto, and by this means acquire happiness. And for what concerns the sovereign, the end he aims at for himself by giving laws to his subjects is the satisfaction and glory redounding to him from the execution of the wise designs he proposes, for the preservation of those who are subject to him. These two ends of the law should never be separated, one being naturally connected with the other, for 'tis the happiness of the subjects that forms the satisfaction and glory of the sovereign. We should therefore take care not to imagine the laws are properly made in order to bring men under a yoke. So idle an end would be quite unworthy of a sovereign, who of his nature ought to be as good as he is potent and wise, and who always acts pursuant to these perfections. Let us say rather that the laws are made to oblige the subjects to act according to their real interests and to choose the surest and best way to attain the end they are designed for, which is happiness. With this view, the sovereign is willing to direct them better than they could themselves, and gives a check to their liberty that they should make give a check to their liberty should they make a bad use of it contrary to their own and the public good. In short, the sovereign commands rational beings. 'Tis on the footing he treats with them. 'Tis on this footing he treats with them. All his ordinances have the stamp of reason. He is willing to reign over our hearts, and if at any time he employs force, 'tis in order to bring back to reason those who have unhappily strayed from it, contrary to their own and the good of society. Wherefore Puffendorf, methinks, speaks somewhat loosely of the comparison he draws between law and counsel, where he says that counsel tends to the ends proposed by those whom it is given, and that they themselves can judge of those ends in order to approve or disapprove them, whereas law aims only at the end of the person that establishes it. And if sometimes it has views in regard to those for whom it is made, 'tis not their business to examine them. This depends entirely on the determination of the legislator. It would be a much juster way, methinks, of expelling the thing to say that laws have a double end relative to the sovereign and the subjects, that the intent of the sovereign in establishing them is to consult his own satisfaction and glory by rendering his subjects happy, and these two things are inseparable, and that it would be doing justice to the sovereign to imagine he thinks only it would be doing injustice to the sovereign to imagine that he thinks only of himself without any regard to the good of those who are his dependents. Puffendorf seems here, as well as in some other places, to give a little too much into Hobbes's principles. And I'm assuming that's Thomas Hobbes. Check out the Leviathan, or I might read that one too on here. We define law, a rule which lays an obligation on subjects of doing or omitting certain things and leaves them at liberty to act or not in other things according as they judge proper. This is what we must explain here in a more particular manner. A sovereign has undoubtedly a right to direct the actions of those who are subject to him, according to the ends he has in view. In consequence of this right, he imposes a necessity on them of acting or not acting after a particular manner in certain cases. And as this obligation is the first effect of law, from thence it follows that all actions which are not positively commanded or forbidden are left within the sphere of natural liberty, and that the sovereign is hereby supposed to grant everybody a permission to act in this respect as they think proper, and this permission is a second effect of the law. We may therefore distinguish the law, taken in its full extent, in an obligatory law, taken in its full extent, into an obligatory law and a law of simple permission. 'Tis true, Grotius, and after him, Puffendorf, are of the opinion that permission is not properly and of itself an effect or action of the law, but are a mere inaction of the legislator. Whatever things, says Puffendorf, the law permits, those it neither commands or forbids, and therefore it really does nothing at all concerning them. But though this different manner of considering the thing be not perhaps of any great consequence, yet Barberek's opinion, Barbeyrac, opinion, such as he has explained it in his notes on the four-sided passages, appears to be much more exact. A permission arising from the legislator, silent, cannot be considered as a simple inaction. The legislator does nothing but with deliberation and wisdom. If he is satisfied with imposing only in some cases an indispensable necessity of acting after a certain manner and does not extend it necessarily further, 'tis because he thinks it agreeable to the end he proposes, and to leave his subjects at liberty in some cases to do as they please. Wherefore, the silence of the legislator imports a positive though tacit permission of whoever he has not forbidden, of whatsoever he has not forbidden or commanded, though he might have done it, and would certainly have done it, had he thought proper. Insomuch as the command or forbidden actions are positively regulated by law, actions that are permitted are likewise positively determined by the same law, though after their manner and according to the nature of the thing. In time, whoever determines certain limits, which he declares we ought not to exceed, does hereby point out how far he permits and consents we should go. Permission, therefore, is a positive and effect of the law as obligation. This will appear still more evident if we consider that having once supposed that man depends on a superior whose will ought to be the universal rule of his conduct, all the rights attributed to man in this state by virtue of which he may act safely with his impunity are founded on the express or tacit permission received from the sovereign or the law. This is so much the truer as everybody agrees that the permission granted by the law and the right from thence resulting imposes on other men an obligation not to resist the person that uses his right, but rather to help him in his respect than do him any prejudice or harm. Obligations, therefore, and permission are naturally connected with each other, and this is the effect of the law, which likewise authorizes those who are disturbed in the exercise of their rights to employ force or to have recourse to the sovereign in order to remove these impediments. Wherever, after having mentioned in the definition of law that it leaves us in certain cases at liberty to act or not act, we added that it secures the subjects thereby in the full enjoyment of their rights. The nature and end of laws shows us their matter or object. The matter of law, in general, are all human actions, internal and external, thoughts and words, as well as deeds, those which relate to another, and those which terminate in the person itself, as far, at least, as the direction of those actions may essentially contribute to the particular good of each person, to that of society in general, and to the glory of the sovereign. This supposes naturally the three following conditions. 1. That the things ordained by law be possible to fulfill, for it would be solely and even cruelty to require of any person under the least combination of punishment, whatever is and always has been above his strength. 2. The law must be of some utility, for reason will never allow any restraint to be laid on the liberty of the subjects merely for the sake of the restraint, and without any benefit or advantage arising to them. 3. In time, the law must in itself be just, that is, conformable to the order and nature of things, as well as to the constitution of man. This is what the very idea of rule requires, which, as we have already observed, is the same as that of law. To these three conditions, which we may call the internal characters of law, namely, that it be possible, just, and useful, we may add two other conditions which in some measure are external. 1. That the law be made sufficiently known. The other, that it be attended with a proper sanction. 'Tis necessary that the laws be sufficiently notified to the subjects, for how could they actually regulate their actions and motions by those laws if they had never any knowledge of them? The sovereign ought therefore to publish these laws in a solemn, clear, and distinct manner. But after that, 'tis the subject's business to be acquainted with the will of the sovereign, and the ignorance or error he may lie under in this respect cannot, generally speaking, be a legitimate excuse in his favor. Ignorance of the law is not a defense. This is what the civilians mean when they lay down a maximum that ignorance or error in regard to the law is blamable and hurtful. Ain't that funny they gave that right after I said that? Irony. Were it not so, the laws would be of no effect, but might always, under a pretext of ignorance, be eluded with impunity. Rich folks. The next thing requisite is that the law be attended with a proper sanction. Sanction is that part of law which includes the penalty enacted against those who transgress it. With regard to the penalty, it is an evil with which the sovereign menaces those subjects who should presume to violate his laws, and which he actually inflicts whenever they violate them, and this with a design of procuring some good, such as to correct the culpable and to admonish the rest, but ultimately that his laws being respected and observed, society should enjoy a state of security, quiet, and happiness. All laws have therefore two essential parts. The first is the deposition of the law, which expresseth the command or prohibition. The second is the sanction, which pronounces the penalty, and tis the sanction that gives it the proper particular force of law. For where the sovereign connected with merely ordaining or forbidding certain things without adding any kind of menace, this would be no longer a law prescribed by authority, but nothing more than a prudent counsel. This does not, however, tis not, however, absolutely necessary that the nature or quality of the punishment be formally specified in the law. 'Tis sufficient that the sovereign declares he will punish, reserving to himself the species and degree of chastisement according to his prudence, judicial discretion. We must also observe that the evil which constitutes the punishment, properly so called, ought not to be a natural production or a necessary consequence of the action intended to be punished. It should be, as it were, an accidental evil inflicted by the will of the sovereign, for whatever the action may have bad of itself and dangerous in its effects, the inevitable consequence cannot be reckoned as proceeding from the law, since it would equally happen without it. The menaces, therefore, of the sovereign must, in order to have some weight, pronounce such punishments as differ from the evil that necessarily arises from the nature of the thing. It may be asked in time whether the sanction of laws may not as well consist in the promise of a recompense as in the commination of some punishment. I answer that this depends in general on the will of the sovereign, who may use either these ways or even employ them both according as his prudence directs. But as question is to know which is the most essential method the sovereign can use in order to enforce the observance of these laws. And as it is certain that man is naturally more sensible of evil than good, it seems therefore more proper to establish the sanction of law and the commination of punishment rather than the promise of recompense. People are seldom induced to violate the laws unless it be with the hopes of procuring some apparent good that deceives them. Wherefore the best way to prevent this deception is to remove the bait that allures them, and to annex the contrary, a real inevitable evil, to disobedience. Should we therefore suppose that two legislators willing to establish the same law proposed one of them great rewards and the other severe punishments, The latter would undoubtedly depose men more effectually to compliance than the former. The finest promise the finest promises do not always determine the will, but the sight of a rigorous punishment staggers and intimidates it. But if the sovereign, by a particular effect of his bounty and wisdom, is willing to join these two means, and to enforce the law by a double motive of observance, there is then nothing wanting to complete its force, being in every respect a perfect sanction. The obligation which the laws impose have exactly a great an extent as the right of the sovereign, and consequently may be said in general that all those who are dependent on the legislator are subject to this obligation, but each law in particular obliges those subjects only to whom the matter of the law may be applied. And this is easily known for the very nature of each law, by which the intention of the legislator in this respect is sufficiently expressed. And then the footnote on the previous page is vel explicite, vel implicite, nam ubi poena nuque scripto, neque implo alicujas, cipiones legis jam transgresse dedit, definiture ibi subentelli telegitir poenam abiterium esse nimerum ex arbitrio pendere legislatoris. And that's from Hobbes Deceive, DECIVE, comma, CAP. That's chapter 14, subsection 8. So Hobbes Deceive, DECIVE, chapter 14, subsection 8. And that was in Latin, and I know I butchered it. And it says, see John Locke, Essay on Human Understanding, Book 2, Chapter 28, subsection 6. And then on the last page it says, see Puffendorf's Law of Nature and Nations, Book 1, Chapter 6, subsection 14, with Barbarek's notes. Okay. So, continuing. Nevertheless, it sometimes happens that particular persons are exempt from the obligation of observing the law, and this is what we call dispensation, on which we have some remarks to make. If the legislator can entirely abrogate a law by a much stronger reason, he can suspend the effect, therefore, with regard to such or such a person. But we must likewise acknowledge that none but the legislator himself is invested with the power. He never ought to use it, but for very good reasons, with a sage moderation, and according to the rules of equity and prudence. For were he without direction or choice to favor too great a number of people with dispensations, he would enervate the authority of the law. Or were he to refuse it in cases perfectly alike, to unreasonable a particular I'm sorry, so unreasonable a partiality would be certainly attended with jealousy and discontent. Sorry, y'all know the old English, man. The F's, the S's look like cursive F's. So that's again, y'all just bear with me. As for what concerns the duration of laws and the manner in which they are abolished, we are to observe that the following principles, in general, the duration of a law, as well as its first establishment, depends on the free will and pleasure of the sovereign, who cannot reasonably tie up his own hands in this respect. And yet every law of itself and by its nature is supposed perpetual and made forever, when it contains nothing in its disposition or in the circumstances attending it that evidently denotes a contrary intention of the legislator, or that may induce us reasonably to presume that it was only a temporary ordinance. The law is a rule. Now, every rule is of itself perpetual, and generally speaking, when the sovereign establishes a law, 'tis not with a design to repeal it, but as the state of things may happen to alter in such a manner that the law, grown useless or hurtful, can no longer be in execution, the sovereign can and ought in that case to repeal and abolish it. It would be absurd and pernicious to society to pretend that laws once enacted ought to subsist forever. Let what inconveniency forever arise. It would be absurd and pernicious to society to pretend that laws once enacted ought to subsist forever, and let what inconveniency forever arise. This repeal may be made in two different manners, either expressly or tacitly. For what the sovereign, well acquainted with the state of things, neglects for a long time to enforce the observance of laws, or formally permits that arises thereto relating to regulated in a manner contrary to his disposition, from thence a strong presumption arises of the obligation of this law, which falls thus of itself, though the legislator has not expressly abolished it. 'Tis plain, we have only glanced here upon the general principles. As for the application that ought to be made of them to each species of law, it requires some modification pursuant to their different nature. But 'tis not our business to enter here into those particulars. Law may be divided into divine or human according as it has God or man for its author. Divine law may be subdivided into two sorts, namely natural and positive, or revealed. Natural law is that which so necessarily agrees with the nature and state of man that without observing its maxims, neither individuals nor society can maintain themselves in an honest and comfortable state. And as this law has an essential agreeableness with the constitution of human nature, the knowledge therefore may be attained merely by the light of reason, and hence it is called natural. Positive or revealed law is that which is not founded on the general constitution of human nature, but only on the will of God, though in other respects this law is established on very good reasons and procures the advantage of those who receive it. We meet with examples of these two sorts of laws in those which God gave formerly to the Jews. 'Tis easy to distinguish such as were natural from those being merely ceremonial or political, having no other foundation but that particular will of God accommodated to the actual state of that people with regard to human laws, considered rigorously as such, as originally proceeding from a forever, I'm sorry, as originally proceeding from a sovereign who presides over the society, they are all positive. For though there are natural laws that are the subject of human laws, they do not derive their obligatory force from the human litigator. They would oblige all the same without any intervention on his part because they come from God. Before we leave these definitions, we must not forget to observe that the science or art of making and explaining laws and of applying them to human actions goes by the general name of jurisprudence. And that's the end of chapter 10.